may be on call. I don't know, Laura, how flexible they are with their time, but I would just suggest that, as is our sort of habit, we just be back here 10 minutes or so after the floor ends, and we'll either continue the discussion that we're about to have, or we'll hear from these other folks. And then we'll continue on through June in that, one of those two things. So we've got the Brain Trust back with us, the ins and outs of the universal school meals, and we had sort of had to leave off yesterday smack in the middle of the conversation about some of the implications, and we were looking at the Agency of Education's recommendations, and you'll recall there were three areas that they really were looking for us to provide some clarification on. And one of them I think we were able to handle pretty easily, saying, we want to be sure that we are drawing down the maximum amount of federal dollars. So we've addressed that. Beth's incorporating that clarification into the language. And then the second one involved the childcare centers that had picked up on had been added to some school food authorities during the pandemic, so that they could also draw down some of those funds. So Beth is back to help answer some of the questions that we had and help us think through and work through how we want to address that. Good morning.
Good morning. Beth St. James, Office of Legislative Counsel. Where would you like to begin?
Well, you just heard my little introduction there. So do you want, we can ask you questions, or if you want to jump in and offer anything that, I'm not sure whether you heard, I can't remember yesterday whether you were here for all of our conversation or.
I left right after my allotted half-hour testimony time. Okay. So if the conversation continued, I did not hear that.
But anyway, Representative Rice.
There was just a quick question I wanted to ask as we ran up against the end of the time, which is the section on clarification commitment to independent schools. Mm-hmm. You had just said that the things you talked to us yesterday about were the things that you had flagged as potential policy. Mm-hmm. And this is just a lot of language and a lot of referring back and forth to the bill. And so I just wanted to hear from you, like, no, none of this is flagging as potential policy changes to me. And this is all just like.
Sure. Do you want me to walk through AOE's recommendations?
No, we had the recommendations mm-hmm. walk through from AOE. I just want to hear from you, like, this is all. None of these things raise a flag for me, or none of them.
Yeah, so I think I started yesterday by saying I had identified three pieces that I felt I needed policy direction from the committee on, and those were what we talked about yesterday. So I did not, in reading AOE's recommendations specifically around, or I should say especially around the clarification of payment to independent schools, I felt like AOE was just providing feedback on the language with some helpful suggestions to clarify based on how they were implementing it. And so I didn't flag those as policy, but the new draft that I will have for you, once we're all set on everything, we'll walk through exactly what the changes are that I made based on AOE's recommendations. And certainly if you all feel that I have overstepped or have made a policy decision for you, we can roll that back. But I didn't, I suppose that defining universal meal supplement could be a policy decision, but that seems like a very reasonable and logical efficiency to take within the bill, if you will. Clarifying the meaning of second breakfasts, I didn't feel like was a policy decision. And it turns out that they are actually referenced in the federal rules for the program. So it's not a Taco Bell situation. And then I think the one thing we didn't really talk about yesterday was the last recommendation from AOE, and that's the provide direction if costs exceed the appropriation piece, where they, AOE mentioned their concern about, since this is an ongoing reimbursement, prorating is not really a thing. And from talking to Rosie and my conversations with your chair, the next draft we have will have all of the same language, but plunked in a different section. Some of it will be plunked in a different section in Title 16, with the intent for it to be treated as categorical aid, the Universal Meal Supplement, so that it's an ongoing, every year included in the budget, like transportation reimbursements and small schools grants and CTE funding, special ed funding, so that it's not an annual, it's not having to be an annual appropriation by a policy committee. And after talking with Rosie, she felt that if that's where the direction the committee was going in, there wouldn't be any need to take into account what happens if they run out of funds, because they would be calculating all of that, and just kind of, it would just be kind of lumped in with the other categorical aid payments every year. So I didn't think any of that were really policy driven, but that's really for you to tell me, not for me to tell you.
So Representative Reich, is that?
Yep.
You're, okay. Representative Levitt?
I just wanted to touch on, we talked a little bit yesterday about 0 to 3-year-olds. I found out from an advocate that they're already covered for federal meals. So we don't, I don't think, and I could be wrong on this, but that's what Hunger Free Vermont said, because I reached out to them and I said, like, this felt like it just popped up. They're covered under a different federal program for their food. So we don't need, I don't think, to put them in this, because then it muddles the issue, because it really should be K through 12.
So my
Or
understanding,
pre-K now through 12.
I would really encourage you to, whether it's this committee that really makes this decision or whether it's another committee, I would really encourage you to hear directly from the field on this. But my understanding is there's 2 programs that child care centers could participate in. One of them is the Child and Adult Care Food Program, which is another USDA child nutrition program that we're not talking about here, that is not part of the Universal Meals Program. The other one is the other ones are the National School Lunch and the National Breakfast programs that our public schools are participating in, that we're talking about when we're talking about universal meals. And my understanding is that during COVID, some public school food authorities kind of allowed some of these child care centers to come in under their school food authority umbrella and participate in the breakfast and lunch federal programs, as opposed to, which is what we're talking about, as opposed to the child and adult care food program. So it would depend on which, if any, food program, federal food program they are participating in. But I am by no means the expert on this. I'm probably the least knowledgeable person about these federal programs. So I would really encourage you to hear from the field specifically to either confirm that or provide even more nuanced information to you. But my information is that there are private daycare centers right now that are participating in the federal meals program under a public school food authority. And therefore, all of the children at those centers, AOE is currently interpreting current law as all of them are qualifying for the meal supplement.
Okay. That's only if they're part of a school food authority.
I believe so.
Okay.
I think that's my understanding as well. And I would just add that again, my understanding is that the intent when we passed legislation last year to temporarily provide this, this funding was that it not include childcare centers. The AOE looked at the language that came out of the bill and said, oh, actually, the way it's written, we do need to provide that funding. And I don't think that was incorrect, but we're now aware of that and charged with saying, is that what we want to do going forward? Understanding that the costs that were, that we've been, that were estimated last year did not include that. And while perhaps not very many are actually taking advantage of it this year, it opens the door potentially for others to take advantage of it and increase the cost. So Representative O'Brien.
I just thought this would be a good time to think about, have the advocate said asked if there are any communities, as in populations, I guess, that are not going to be covered under this legislation, or are there communities that they feel, right, there are other USDA programs that would work just as well. So whether we add a community here or we take one away, I would like to hear maybe, I don't feel like I've heard that from the advocates as far as like the last 2 years we're hitting everybody we really want to hit. So let's just move forward with that.
Yeah, good. I think it might be helpful to get somebody in to address this so that it's not hearsay or, secondhand information, but that's my understanding anyway, is that there's nobody is strongly saying, oh yes, we would actually like to open this up to even more, a larger potential universe. I was just going to point out too that this goes back to, and I know independent schools, everybody's good with that, but the memo that we've gotten from Rosie on the first page, clarification of payment to independent schools. There's a reference in section 1 there, begins on page 5, lines 12 and 13. At the end of that paragraph, it says on page 6, lines 12 and 13. And I think that should be page 5.
Okay,
If you just want to circle that and check.
Yep. I think, addressed in the new draft, addressed what Rosie was trying to get at here.
Okay.
And I understood what she was saying,
Okay.
but I appreciate you flagging that.
Other thoughts? Yes, Representative Crowe.
Have we made the decision? Are we incorporating the local food incentives, and what does that look like if we are?
So, okay, so good. We've got a couple of minutes and let's hear some thoughts about that. So I think, yes, I think we would like to, if the committee wants to make any changes to local food and local purchasing incentive, going forward, this would probably be a good place to do it. So then the question is, all right, do we? And what would those changes be? I know yesterday there was some discussion about, for example, is there a way to make it explicit that if you raise a beef in Vermont and take it across the river to your processing facility that you own in another state, that could qualify. And right now, arguably doesn't, but it's an open question anyway.
I appreciate wanting to make sure that Boyden beef can be in the schools, but I feel that we could do something that's a little bit less restrictive and helps other farms that are dealing with this processing capacity issue and still allows for food that is local to Vermont, but is simply, being processed just over the border in New York or in New Hampshire, depending on which other state the farm is.
Yep.
And still meets the sort of spirit of what we're going for with getting local food into schools.
So do you, you would, in other words, not be restrictive and say it has to be
The
owned
ownership,
by.
right? And, you know, recognizing that there's probably something that we have to do to make sure that it's not, you know, an animal that was on a farm for 10 days and being called Vermont, but that there are farms that are having animals processed that for all, you know, the rest of the animal's life was spent on a farm in Vermont, and we want them to count, you know, that need to count.
Okay, good, yep. Representative Graham.
So I would say I would agree with that if you were taking your animals across the border, having them slaughtered and bring that meat back. But according to Boyden's, they butcher New Hampshire beef. And he didn't indicate whether or not he actually separated.
He did indicate that.
He said that he was able to separate.
He didn't say he was.
Yeah.
Well, sure. So yes, I think we would want to be clear that it's Vermont meat, that, you know, regardless of where it was processed, that if a farmer takes Vermont animals over the border to a non-Vermont processor and then brings them back into Vermont, then that meat counts.
So he'd have to use his own animals. No slaughter. Bring them over.
Or the animals of another Vermont farmer, right? As long as,
Right.
yeah. Because I think that's a lot of what he's doing, right, is.
He made it sound like he could very easily separate out New Hampshire beef and Vermont beef.
I think you're right. Representative Duncan.
I totally agree. I think though that we need to have some sort of way of demonstrating that there aren't other facilities within the state that he could have depended on. And that's the problem with you know, meat farmers, myself included. It's very hard to find processing in state. So, I mean, clearly if that's the bottleneck, then I feel like we have to go out of state. But if we do allow that, I think the farmer needs to demonstrate, you know, that there is a bottleneck issue.
So how to do that might be a challenge, yep.
Yeah.
But okay, good point. Representative O'Donnell.
Is there ever language that says, you know, we're gonna stick with our Vermont local food definition, but just add and or at the discretion of, say, the secretary of the agency can essentially, you know, waive that restriction if it fits in something like this? Because we don't wanna discourage somebody like Boyden and they're just being creative by buying a processing plant in New Hampshire.
Right.
So, and then I can't imagine there are gonna be hundreds of these cases. It's, you know, probably a dozen.
Yep. Yeah, so I don't know the answer to that, whether that's something that is done language wise or whether, you know, policy wise, we would want to cede that, you know, broad authority.
Maybe that out-of-state facility should abide by Vermont labor laws, like, you know, same minimum wage standard, you know, a lot of. No,
Sure. Yeah.
well, that's what I mean. I mean, you know, if Boyden has made, I mean, you know, this is totally hypothetical, not a reflection on Mark whatsoever. But if that hypothetical, you know, farmer set up shop out of state to avoid higher wage prices,
Excellent point.
that would be very problematic.
Okay, any other thoughts? Yeah.
Just separately from the meat processing piece, the other thing that we had talked about, perhaps wanting to make a carve out for is the direct purchase relationship with farmers. You know, we've heard from school food service directors that they have or had these existing long-term relationships with local farms, you know, if they're in Dulles Falls and they're right across the river, or certainly I know of folks around my district that would have relationships over the border in New York, and do want to sort of allow for I think my sort of higher level problem is that the local food definition that was worked on a couple of years ago was really worked on for commerce. It was worked on as a labeling thing to sort of defend the ability of Vermont producers to call things Vermont and make sure that others couldn't use that label inappropriately. And is that sort of the best strict definition for what we're trying to get at, which is more food grown nearby schools served in those schools, right?
Sure.
And so is that sort of direct relationship carve out something that we want to talk about also?
Yeah. Right, we've been hearing that, it's not simply helpful to farmers, it's good to implant the idea that, oh, local food is something tasty and I can,
Right, and also, as living in a place that's close to the border, I know that just because a farm is just over the border in New York, for instance, doesn't mean that they don't employ people who live in Vermont or sell food to people who, feed people who live in Vermont. These are not strict border relationships, and there is that crossover. And so it's not like, oh, well, by allowing a farm that's over the border to participate in this, it means 100% of those dollars are leaving our state and not supporting the local. They do support the local.
yeah, right, it's a little bit, right, yeah.
And since we're already dealing with those two definitions, one, the school board sort of starts with their own local foods definition, and then it turns to this one in statute. It seems like, could we just create one definition that just applies to school food? That would incorporate, back more to that 30 miles within.
Yeah.
This thought.
Rodney has.
Yeah.
My suggestion would be, if we want to do the food incentive, we do it, let the agency enforce local food statute.
So,
If they feel that it's okay to. We did one, I think it was for the movement of bees, that allowed so many miles outside of the state border.
Yeah, what we've heard so far from the agency though is that they're sort of passing it on to the farmers, right, to self-certify that they meet the definition.
Right, and also the time when Apple coming from New York.
apples processed
In Vermont.
They were processed.
grown in New York,
Yeah, just across the lake.
yeah.
Just a comment, it feels like we're putting the wrong question first. I think first we need to answer, what do we want this to do? What is our objective as far as the local food? Are we looking to supply schools within a certain radius and diversify their options as far as getting more farms available, or are we just trying to get Vermont food in schools, or the cheapest food that's fairly local? I guess that's what I'm kind of trying to get a
Yeah,
pulse
no, I
on.
think that's a good way to frame it. I just want to, I know we all have to go in a second, but while we still have Beth here, is there anything, and we'll hopefully have her back later.
I have no more testimony. I'm not scheduled anywhere this morning, so.
Okay, great. Anything else right now that we want to ask her? No, okay. Representative Levitt?
Oh, no, I'm shaking my head no.
Okay, did you have a question now?
No, I have no question.
Okay.
I guess my only question was, sorry, and now remembering, one of the reasons about Vermont food is for every dollar we spend on school meals, it gives $1.60 back into the Vermont economy.
Right, I'm fully aware of that. I'm just wondering, are we trying to incentivize farms within a close proximity to schools? Or if there's not to pick on Boyden, but
Right.
say he can make fairly cheap burger, do we want him to be supplying schools in Bennington? Is that our objective? If that's what we're looking to do, that's fine. But if we're looking to get more farms into local schools, then we're gonna wanna take a different step than that. That's the question I'm trying to answer, and I think we need to answer that before we can answer the next ones.
Makes sense?
Yeah, me too, I agree.
At the moment, is it Act 67, the local food incentive? There's none of that in what Beth's marking up here. So it seems like we have to go all in on that, or.
Yeah, so right now, nothing, Act 67 is there and Annex, are you saying, and there's, what's there doesn't distinguish between Bennington and,
No, I'm saying that we have a universal school meals bill.
Yeah.
With very little reference to local food incentive. That's a whole nother act. So
Right.
we're gonna marry these two, right? We've got a lot of work to do on that part of it, or
Yeah, well, I don't think.
separate them and
I don't think there's that much really that we would need to do. If we at the end of this discussion figure, there's nothing about the way Act 67 currently looks that we feel strongly enough that needs to be changed, then we're not gonna do anything with that. It's just universal school meals. If we feel like, oh, okay, we want to provide some clarity on what we mean by local, then we can just add a sentence or two to universal school meals, in a new section that.
references
Yeah.
Act 67.
Yeah.
You would, I'm sorry, can I clarify?
Please,
You would
yes.
just amend the law, right? Because Act 67 is actually in your green books. It's a statute, it's current law in statute. So you would just amend that and you can, that's your jurisdiction. You can do